Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Writers Series. My name's Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programs for people of all ages and backgrounds, all currently available online. For more information on upcoming programs, our website is wab.org. Thank you for joining us. We're so happy to have Kate Reid Petty here for the launch of her novel, True Story. An inventive and breathtaking exploration of a woman finding her voice in the wake of trauma, True Story is part psychological thriller, part fever dream, and part timely comment on sexual assault, power, and the very nature of truth. Ingeniously constructed and full of twists and turns, the book marks the debut of a singular, daring new voice in fiction. Kate Reid Petty has been recognized with a Narrative Magazine Below 30 award. Her short fiction has been published in Electric Literature, American Short Fiction, Blackbird, Ambit, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. She lives in Baltimore. True Story is available in our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. Kate is also teaching an online workshop this Saturday called Practical Magic: 5 Tools to Break Writer's Block. There's still time to sign up, and I'll put the link in the chat as well. First, we'll hear from Kate, and then she will be in conversation with our Director of Youth Programs, Sally Bittner Bonn. Sally is also a writer, performer, and teaching artist. If you have any questions, you can feel free to submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Kate, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been a long distance fan of Writers and Books and the work you all do. So it's an honor to get to read tonight. And again, yes, I'll be reading from. I'll show you the cover just to see the physical book because it feels good to hold up. True Story is my debut novel, and just by way of introduction, the part that I'm going to read from tonight, you don't need sort of much context to understand, but again, this is a book about, and I should offer a little trigger warning, the book is about sexual assault. It does deal with that theme. The part I'm going to read tonight does not, however. The book starts with a rumor of a sexual assault at a high school in the late 90s, and then follows the lives of 4 people who are all affected by that rumor in different ways for the next 15 years. And the book, as it goes through these different people's lives, it also changes genre as it changes to different characters' perspectives. So what I'm going to read from tonight is a section that is a little bit like a horror novel. Again, not too scary what I'm going to read tonight. It's sort of just the setup. This is a character, Nick, who was a bystander to that rumor. He was at the sort of sports party in high school. And he's now in his mid-20s, and he has gone on a road trip to forget a relationship that has ended. He's going to go feel sorry for himself. So Nick was parked at one of those backwoods gas stations that haven't even installed credit card readers on the pumps. It was Thursday, 2 hours into the drive, and he was already bored. So when the check engine light had clicked on, he'd stopped at this gas station to check the oil in his mom's car, pretending he knew how, saying to himself in his head, "See, Lindsay, I'm responsible." But then apparently he didn't properly latch the bar that holds the hood open, and it lost its grip and slammed down on the fingers of his left hand. He anticipated the pain before he felt it, a sharp tingling and then a numb ache, and he knew it was going to be bad, and then, Jesus, he felt it, suddenly bad and getting worse. He jumped up and down a little bit, trying to push through the pain to its peak and out the other side, trying to tackle it head on, because the whole point of this weekend was to build up the discipline to look at pain straight in its ugly face. Still, his fingers hurt, but it was too early in the drive to start drinking. He'd never make it all the way to Lindsay's cousin's cabin if he started drinking now. So instead, he grabbed his backpack out of the back seat and pulled out the $70 bottle of bourbon he'd bought special for this trip, and just held it against his left hand to see if the proximity made the pain better. And when it didn't, he opened the bottle and sniffed, which didn't really help either, except in the way that pregnant women learn to breathe. He thought about taking a little sip just to get his brain to slow down a bit and stop chattering like this, on and on and on. But it really was too early to start drinking, and there were people around. So he tucked the bottle into his backpack, congratulating himself on his discipline, and went inside the gas station and bought a pack of cigarettes and a lighter and a package of cookies and a big waxed paper cup of Mountain Dew as reward for not drinking. He stood just outside the door with the sun in his face, set the soda and the cookies on the lid of the big red trash can, and unwrapped the plastic from the cigarette pack. Using his right hand to flick the lighter, holding the cigarette between his left thumb and pinky, because all his other fingers were still hurting, he lit up and inhaled. A beefy man with leathery skin walked past and gave Nick a look, like Nick was wearing a clown suit or something, even though he was just wearing jeans and an old Metallica t-shirt. Maybe the man was frowning because of the way Nick was holding his cigarette, or maybe it was because of the way his hair was cut, or maybe it was some essential thing about Nick, the air of a comfortable white suburban middle-class upbringing that Nick would never be able to hide. Nick tried not to let it bother him. What did he care what that redneck thought? All he cared about was how good this cigarette felt, and how great this trip was going to be, how great this trip already was. He pretended that his bender had already started, that the journey was the reward, that the drinking he was getting ready to do was just an excuse to be alone in the woods instead of the other way around. And he switched the cigarette to his right hand and held it with his first two fingers, like all good Americans, looking at the road ahead of him and at the sparse woods beyond the gas station where old cans and piles of trash were scattered all around. When his cigarette was almost gone, he pulled out another and lit it with the first, and it was delicious as he inhaled. But then he realized that if he didn't stop himself now, he was going to smoke this whole pack of cigarettes in the next half hour. And he was seized by an impulse to be good, to be better, to be strict with himself, and also to be wild. He started throwing cigarettes away, 3 or 4 at a time, enjoying the recklessness of it, the discipline and masochism, plus the sheer wastefulness. He really was such an asshole, wasn't he? Yes, you're right about that, Lindsay. And this was truly going to be a weekend of nonsense and chaos, a personal pan pizza-sized performance art piece. Hey, asshole. Nick froze, the nearly empty packet of cigarettes in his left hand and 4 cigarettes in his right, holding the lid of the trash can open and the lit cigarette balanced on his lip, the ash lengthening delicately off the burning end. And Nick looked over his shoulder and saw the beefy man again, walking out of the store, leading with his belly, which was pronounced infirm. And he walked up, his belly uncomfortably close to Nick, and said, "That's not how you smoke a pack of cigarettes." Nick pulled the 4 cigarettes away from the can and held them in front of his chest in a closed fist, and wondered if this was the start of a fight. He had never been in a fight with a stranger, especially not such a large and leathery stranger, and he felt terrified and wondered if he could give this man one of his pints of cheap whiskey as a peace offering, which would be totally fine. He could stop by another liquor store. And so he smiled at the man with all of his teeth, telegraphing how little of a threat he was, and tucked the 4 cigarettes back in the pack. "I'm trying to quit," he said, "so I can't keep these all. I'm throwing most of them away, but I'm going to keep just one, and I'm going on a trip to the woods. This way I can only have one more." The man, squinted at him, asked, "What woods you going to?" And Nick wondered, was there something in the guy's mouth? Was he chewing something? "Just outside the state park, over yonder in Young's County," he said, embarrassed that he had said yonder, worried the man had noticed the affectation, and also worried that he was wrong about his landmarks, because Nick had only been to this cabin once, with Lindsay, more than a year ago, and he didn't know which state park it was close to. He just knew the state park was a thing they had talked about visiting. "Well, you should be careful," the man said, his eyebrows up, real serious. "There's killers in the woods." Then his face changed as he laughed to let Nick in on the joke, a deep laugh that stretched his mouth open wide, and Nick smiled again with all of his non-threatening teeth and kind of went, "Ha," in a way he hoped was non-committal. The man was shaking his head to himself, laughing at his own joke, as he pulled a cigarette pack out of his shirt pocket and opened it to show Nick the single cigarette left inside, then closed it and held it out, an offering. "Here, I'll trade your sins away," he said. Nick struggled to understand the deal for an embarrassing second, but pulled himself together and took the man's pack with a single cigarette and traded it for his own pack, which was now half empty, or half full, depending on the man's outlook on life. The man said, "I usually don't smoke Camels, but a little experimentation never hurt anyone." And then, honest to God, the man winked and kind of raised an eyebrow, and Nick smiled and made a gesture like he was tipping an imaginary hat, and then turned and walked quickly back to his mom's car, trying to commit the line to memory, knowing he would tell this story over beers for years to come. Maybe not to Lindsay, but maybe, yes, to Lindsay. Maybe she would laugh if she heard. "Oh, Nick," she might say, shaking her head, but smiling at his story about the time some redneck propositioned Nick at a gas station in the backwoods that Nick only in that moment realized was actually one of those cruising spots that, for the most part, had been rendered obsolete by the internet. Nick felt the man's eyes on his back, but just kept walking, walked purposefully to his car, keeping his back straight, trying not to look like he was rushing. When he had opened his cookies and his Mountain Dew and pulled back onto the narrow highway, it was just afternoon. So if he drove 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, he'd get to the cabin with a couple of hours of daylight left to build a warm fire and a good buzz. But almost immediately, he realized the flaw in his plan, which was that he was going to have to drive for 3 more hours, and it was already boring, and he had already eaten all of the cookies. It was deep fall, and the trees on the mountains around him were burnished red and orange, but there were just so many of them. It was hard to see them as beautiful. And in fact, they mostly just reminded Nick of the background photo on the computer he had used at his mother's friend's consulting firm 3 summers ago, before he was informed that he was no longer an intern there because of one little nap in the handicapped bathroom. He'd left that morning on an impulse, and so had forgotten to bring the cord that turned the car's tape deck into a CD player. And he had no tapes, and the radio was no good. It was more like a parody of radio. There were only 3 stations, and all of them were broadcasting the same booming voice, going on about some character that Nick guessed was biblical, but did not recognize. His mom would be so disappointed. And after scrolling through the dials for an eternal half hour, Nick reached over and pulled the $70 bourbon out of his backpack and held it between his legs to remind himself of the reward on its way. And then he pulled into the left lane and drove a little faster, eager to get there, then cut the radio off completely and said out loud, "I'm going to have to face myself at some point," which was actually one of the main goals of the trip, to see himself clearly and all of his faults, the way Lindsay had seen him, which was why he was going to the cabin where she had first asked him to stop drinking, and why he was going to spend 3 days there getting good and drunk. Lindsay's cousin had bought the cabin years earlier with the intention of fixing it up into a nice rental vacation home, but then never did. The cousin apparently rarely followed through on plans. And so the cabin was never actually renovated, but merely in a state of constant repair, fighting the entropy of the forest. And Nick and Lindsay had laughed so hard when they'd stayed there for her birthday, the weekend she'd asked that he spend just 3 days with her not drinking. They kept finding tools hidden in strange places, like the power saw stored on the pile of towels in the bathroom. So Nick didn't think it would be a problem for him to head up there now. The cabin wasn't even that nice, and even if he wasn't technically invited, he knew for a fact that nobody ever used it from November to February. It wasn't winterized. So Nick's bender wasn't going to hurt anybody. On a whim, he unscrewed the cap of the $70 bourbon, checked in his rear view, and when there were no police, just some indifferent trucks, he took a quick pull just to see what it felt like to drink expensively on the highway. Nobody was surprised when it felt pretty good, or when he took another, deeper pull. You know, it's a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.
Such a compelling section of the book that just snowballs for anyone who hasn't read it. Yeah,
I love to read that section. It feels like I feel like it like has a good energy to it, but then I'm always halfway through. I'm like, oh God, this is exhausting. Like it's a lot to read in Nick's kind of like spinning brain for sure.
Yeah, and it just continues that section. Someday I just want to start by asking you about the structure of your book. The structure is just fascinating. For anyone who hasn't read the book, it includes narrative in the first, second, and third person. It includes emails. It includes college essay drafts written by one of the main characters, short screenplays written by a couple of the main characters. I mean, it's a whole really interesting collection of things that kind of shift and change. It must have been so much fun to write.
It was actually, nobody has asked that question exactly that way, but it was really fun.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you landed on this structure?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the book came together organically. That sort of opening section at the very beginning of the book is a section in the same character Nick's voice, but it is he is in first person in that section, and it's he's writing about his high school experience, sort of going to, surrounding this party that is at the heart of the book. And so that piece was the first piece that I sort of started writing, and I then was interested in this character. Nick is a really sort of thinks he's well-meaning, but is really misguided, partly because he wants to be part of the group. And I was interested in that perspective, but I didn't want to write a whole book about, first of all, about a man, and especially not on such a serious topic, and such a topic when more voices need to be heard. And so kind of growing out from there, the other pieces then kind of came into place, and there was a lot of freedom in the writing. I was sort of letting myself write whatever I wanted to as I was kind of going through it. And I had early on, I had the idea of, it's going to be Nick, and then there's another character named Alice, and the two of them kind of alternate voices throughout. So I kind of had a little bit of a roadmap with that. But I was, then sort of a new sort of section would kind of come up for me, and a character in a different time in their life, and I would sort of explore it and kind of follow where it went. So while I was writing, I was aware that the structure was really unorthodox and kind of bananas, and I was telling myself for a lot of it, I was like, I don't think that this is gonna work. Like, I don't think anybody's gonna want to read this. And so because of that, I did have a lot of freedom in the writing, and I'm glad that I kind of let it be what it ended up being. Yeah.
Excellent. It's so interesting. It's interesting to hear where it started from too. We do have a number of people watching and listening in tonight. I want to invite all of you to put questions in the Q&A box or comments. We'll be happy to take some things from our audience tonight. I will ask a few more questions as well. So at the core of your book is really the idea that stories shape us, whether they are quote unquote true stories, stories that we tell ourselves, stories that others tell us about ourselves, stories, they guide our lives. As mentioned, this is, shaped around a traumatic event, a sexual assault. And yet this book is also just such a strong feminist statement, I think, especially, in these times that we're living in. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about, you mentioned what part of the writing came first, but did threads of the story come first, or did the kind of the themes and the messages of this true story come first? Can you talk if there's the chicken and the egg?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's sort of two parts of the storytelling element that are really important to me. And one of them is that I think we see this especially in cases of sexual assault and sexual misconduct and rape. The story of these events becomes almost, it takes up so much time and emotional weight and space because our society is litigating these things so heavily, and has been. I feel like over the past 50 years, our sense of our awareness of sexual assault in all its many forms has really grown. In the past 10 years, we've really sort of rapidly expanded our society's ability to recognize and sort of honor survivors and victims and give and sort of actually achieve some kind of justice, or at least try for it. And I feel like especially in my lifetime, there have just been so many cases that an incident will happen similar to what happens in the book. And then there are, sort of 6 months of everybody having a conversation about it, people who are involved, people who are not involved. We see that in the news, we see it in court cases. I felt like the act of storytelling was such an important site of how the power in that dynamic and that in these situations kind of plays out. And so I wanted to really explore that place. And when I sort of started writing from Nick's perspective and looking at these, how these boys are talking about in this high school, I was really thinking about how they saw it as a story, and sort of the kind of tragedy and horror of that their ability to see it as a story. And then what does that mean for the survivor of the actual incident? What does that mean for the other people? And so storytelling just felt like an important political thing to explore. But then, aside from that, I think I am probably just always really fascinated with storytelling and how, and I think this is, true across our lives. We all are shaped by the stories we tell about ourselves and other people tell about us. I'm interested in the ways that I personally will sort of watch a movie that I watched when I was 11. There's a piece of it in my brain that I still kind of make some decisions based on how that story kind of played out and how that should work. And so I think it's also, I think, something, beyond my political and feminist goals for this book. I think it's also something I think that all of the humans I know wrestle with, and I always want to kind of explore that and illuminate how that works. Yeah.
I think it's so powerful, the two main women characters in your story who really approach story in two different ways, and their attitudes and their commitment to it. And two different ways, and your book shows how much those two ways are valid and important and matter, and that there's not one right way to approach storytelling or listening to stories that people tell us about each other, about ourselves, etc. So I think that's a really powerful and important part of your book.
Yeah, I hope so. I do feel like story, like in some situations, there becomes sort of an expected way of how things usually go. And I think that can be very limiting for people who are experiencing a wide variety of just the normal human emotions of anything that happens to us. And, if we're expected to go through things a certain way, I think it limits our own personal ability to process it. And so I wanted with Alice to really explore a character who is pushing back against that expectation and really, shaping for herself how she wants this story told.
Excellent. We have a question from Linda that I'm so interested in as well. Linda says, what is your writing routine? How do you structure your schedule for writing?
That's a really good question. And I struggle with it, and I go through different phases, and I used to be a lot harder on myself about not having like an easy answer to this question, because it is such a, I feel like a lot of like the most famous and successful writers have like really beautiful kind of tight, clear writing routines. But what I've learned for myself is that having some flexibility is important. And I find that often I'll have a routine for like 2 or 3 months, and then I will shake it up a little bit. Right now I'm writing for like a good chunk of the day, like 4 or 5 hours in kind of the beginning of the day, but I'm starting later than I used to. I used to try to start by 8 o'clock. And now I'm starting about like 9 or 10. I'm doing some other kinds of things first, and then turning over to the writing. But yeah, I guess I think if anybody is looking for advice, I think it is good to have a schedule, can kind of keep you going. But I mean, actually, this might be something I talk about on Saturday, this workshop that I'm going to be doing with writers and books, that is about sort of breaking through writer's block. I think sometimes those routines can become like constricting and kind of feed perfectionism and kind of tighten us up. And so I find that like a little bit of a change of a routine can be inspiring sometimes too.
That's great. Do you have a space that you always write in, or do you?
I do. I do. We are very lucky that we live in Baltimore, so we were able to have a house with space. We used to live in New York where we didn't have a lot of space, but so because of that, I do have a room in my house that is that I've sort of carved out just for writing. It used to be the room where we would put clutter, like that we would just like put things that we didn't have space for. But I have since cleaned it out, and it does feel really good to have a space that is sort of dedicated just to writing. I think it were, when we did have an apartment, even then I had sort of like this is the place where I sit, and this is like the coffee mug that I put next to it. Like there's ways to create that sense of specialness and ritual to your writing routine, but I'm super lucky to have a space for it right now.
Excellent. Just a reminder to anybody who's listening in, feel free to put any questions or comments into the Q&A, and we can share them with Kate. You are one of these authors that's in the unique position that your book came out in the midst of a global pandemic. And you have obviously not been able to tour in the way that would normally happen when a book comes out in this way. Can you talk a little bit about the ways, I know you've come up with some really creative ideas to connect with readers, and have been kind of thinking outside the box. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your experience has been?
Yeah, that's that has been actually a real sort of surprise joy of the pandemic. Was early on, I think everybody was really scrambling to figure out how can we sort of do these author events and sort of continue to promote books online. And so I felt really inspired in March and April and May, because there were so many things online, and it was really cool to see how brave so many bookstores and authors were being, where they're just like, okay, I'm going to launch my book on Zoom, and we don't know what this looks like. And so I mean, it was such a terrible time, but there was something really comforting and delightful about how many author events I got to go see. And I feel like I got to see people that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. But then by about, my book came out in August, and sort of by that time, it was sort of like we had figured out what a Zoom event looked like. And I felt like, I was like, oh, I kind of wanted to see something new, or I kind of want to do something new. So I've been lucky to experiment with a couple of different things. One of my early book launches, I was lucky to get Elif Batuman, who's a great writer. She joined me for a Q&A, and she was willing to play Two Truths and a Lie with me, which is kind of like, a little bit on theme with the book, and also just to give something a little bit for the audience. So that was a really good time. I actually saw, I feel like I've started to see more of these kinds of authors being like, okay, I'm gonna loosen up a little bit and kind of push myself and see what I can do. So yeah, I guess to answer your actual question, while it's crazy hard, and sort of the entire publishing industry is having such a strange time right now. And also I just want to encourage everybody to support your local bookstore and go buy books from your local independent bookstore. Do your Christmas shopping now. Definitely such a hard time, but and you don't have to buy a true story, just buy something. But that at the same time, I'm just really grateful for the weird and unexpected connections that I've gotten to have, and just how supportive and positive everyone has been. It's been great.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. I mean, it's what a time that we're living in. I do find that, there are connections being made that couldn't have been made otherwise. And yet, obviously, there are so many things that have been lost because of the situation that we're in. So, various things to look at. I have another question from Linda. She says, what are you working on now? Could you give us a hint?
Yeah, I mean, I am still really interested in storytelling. So my second novel is a real struggle. Even though I sort of talk about inspiring writing routines, I'm definitely struggling through it. But the sort of short pitch is that it's about two sisters who are cleaning out their mother's house after she's passed away. And at the same time, there's sort of climate change. There's flooding happening in their hometown that they're wrestling with as well. So it's a little bit about things being submerged and things being uncovered. So, yeah.
Excellent. We'll look forward to that.
I think that, Sally, there's also a question I want to make sure I don't miss that's in the Q&A.
Yes. I just caught that. So we have a question from Allison that says, how did you go about finding the right agent, or did your agent find you? What are the two most important pieces of advice you would give to emerging novelists who believe their manuscript is ready to be shopped around?
That's good. And I was going to offer, if Allison, if you want to reach out to Writers and Books, or I'm on Twitter and Instagram, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to give you more detailed advice about that as well. I got a lot of advice from Janet Friedman, who's a literary agent. Her blog has great advice about writing query letters, finding agents, all of these things. And I found everything she says, I found to be very true. So listen to her. And then I think the other thing is to really don't feel, try not to have a scarcity mentality. Try to really respect and protect your book. I think one downfall that I know that have happened to friends is sort of, it's possible to get it to sort of leap for an agent too quickly, or to feel a little bit over eager or sort of desperate to sort of have somebody take on your book. And it's such an important relationship as a writer, and it's such a valuable ally. So really taking the time and making sure that the person you're connecting with is someone you trust and you like, and you feel like you're on the same page about your career is really important. I'll say I found my agent at, I went to a writing conference. There's the Sewanee Writers Conference is in Tennessee. And one of the things that you do if you go there is you do get to meet multiple agents and have sort of like little networking things. And so I was lucky to meet Emily Forland in person there. And that was just so valuable because we kind of had a good personal rapport, as well as she admires my work and was happy to work with it. So Yeah, but again, Alice, I'm happy to talk more if you want to find me on Twitter or Instagram. Yeah.
Fantastic. We have a question from Beth. Were there any additional characters or viewpoints that were cut?
Yeah, I mean, there were some different things that I was playing with early on, especially when I was kind of exploring what the novel was. I had this sort of joke that I always tell people, that there was a zombie erotica section that I was working on, which is true, but definitely wouldn't work within this book or within this subject material. But I was sort of playing with like, what's the extreme of genres that I can write in, and what would that look like? And there is also there was a character at the end of the horror section of the novel. If anybody has read the book, the section when Nick is in the woods that I read from, the original ending of that section was a little bit more dramatic and more kind of grand guignol, like in the horror tradition. And there was a sort of a monster that appears and gets explained a little bit more in my very, very first draft. And that got cut because just in the working with it sort of lopsided the whole book. It was like too extreme in the genre space. And so I ended up pulling that back. But that monster may come back in some other project sometime.
Excellent. I think we are just out of time here, and anyone who joined us late, you can check the chat for the link to buy Kate's book from Ampersand and to join Kate's workshop on Saturday. Kate said buy any book from your local bookstore, which I definitely agree with. But if you haven't read her book, it is just a spellbinding, page-turning, moving, thought-provoking piece of work. So I highly encourage you to read it if you haven't. Kate, this has just been a joy. I'm so glad you could join us tonight.
I've had the best time. Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you to Writers and Books. Thank you to Dan, or everybody. This has been the best. Thank you for everybody for coming.